Here's something that haunts military historians to this day. In the winter of 1942, nearly 300,000 German soldiers were slowly dying in a ruined city on the Volga River. Their commander begged to retreat. His generals begged. Even some of Hitler's closest advisors whispered that withdrawal was the only rational choice. The Führer's response? A two-word telegram: stand fast. Why would a leader sentence his own army to death when escape was still possible? This isn't just about military tactics or wartime strategy. This is about what happens when ego becomes more powerful than reason, when symbolism trumps survival, when a dictator's personal mythology collides with brutal reality. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just the bloodiest battle in human history. It was the moment Nazi Germany's fate was sealed, not by enemy bullets, but by one man's refusal to admit he could be wrong. What makes this story so gripping isn't just the scale of suffering or the dramatic reversal of fortune. It's the psychological horror of watching thousands of men realize they've been abandoned by their own leader, left to freeze and starve, not because retreat was impossible, but because their Führer wouldn't allow it. And here's what will shock you most. There was a moment, a single crystalline moment, when one general tried to disobey Hitler's order and save the army on his own. What happened to him will reveal the true cost of loyalty in a regime built on fear. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand something crucial. Hitler didn't just refuse retreat once, he refused it 7 times. 7 desperate pleas from his commanders, 7 chances to save hundreds of thousands of lives, 7 moments when reason could have prevailed. And each refusal reveals something darker about how power corrupts judgment, how pride becomes more addictive than victory, and how a leader can become so detached from reality that his own army's destruction becomes preferable to his personal humiliation. The winds that swept across the Russian steppe that winter carried more than snow. They carried the screams of the dying, the crack of frozen limbs snapping like kindling, and the terrible silence that falls when hope finally dies. But before we understand how it ended, we need to understand how Hitler trapped himself in a prison of his own making and why he dragged an entire army down with him. The seeds of Stalingrad's catastrophe were planted long before the first German soldier set foot in the city. They were planted in Hitler's mind, in his obsession with willpower over reality, in his conviction that determination alone could bend the laws of military science. To understand why he refused to authorize retreat, we must first understand what Stalingrad meant to him, not as a city, but as a symbol of his personal duel with Stalin himself. By the summer of 1942, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union had already deviated dramatically from its original plan. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was supposed to be a lightning campaign, 6 weeks, maybe 8, and the communist state would collapse like a house of cards. Hitler had studied Napoleon's failure in Russia and convinced himself he knew better. The French emperor had divided his forces, moved too slowly, let the Russians draw him deep into their endless territory. Hitler would be different. He would strike with overwhelming force, encircle and destroy the Red Army before it could retreat, and seize Moscow before winter arrived. Except none of that happened. The Russians fought with a ferocity that shocked the Wehrmacht. They retreated, yes, but not in panic, in organization, burning everything behind them, trading space for time. Soviet soldiers fought to the death in encircled pockets, buying precious days for their comrades to escape and regroup. The German advance, though spectacular by any measure, was slowing. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of primitive roads. The panzers that had raced across France found themselves bogged down in Russian mud, then frozen solid by frostbite the German army wasn't equipped to handle. When winter came early in 1941, it came with a vengeance that made the German troops' inadequate uniforms and frozen equipment a cruel joke. The panzers wouldn't start, the rifles jammed, lubricants froze solid, soldiers lost fingers and toes to frostbite by the thousands. Medical supplies ran low, the wounded froze to death before they could reach field hospitals. And Moscow, the prize that was supposed to fall like ripe fruit, held. The Red Army counterattacked with fresh Siberian divisions accustomed to winter warfare, and for the first time, the supposedly invincible German Wehrmacht was forced to retreat. This was Hitler's first real taste of failure in the East, and it enraged him beyond measure. Throughout the winter of 1941–1942, he held emergency meetings at his headquarters, screaming at his generals, pounding tables, firing anyone who suggested retreat. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was removed from command. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch was dismissed. Guderian, the architect of the Panzer Blitzkrieg, was sent home in disgrace. Hitler replaced them with officers who would follow orders without question, men who understood that suggesting retreat was career suicide. But here's what nobody knew at the time, what was only discovered in documents after the war. Hitler had already decided that if he couldn't conquer Russia in 1942, he would turn the war into a blood sacrifice, a Wagnerian apocalypse where Germany would die in flames rather than surrender. Stalingrad would become the test case for this philosophy. Keep watching, because this mindset explains not just why he refused retreat, but why he seemed almost eager for his army to be destroyed. The message rippled through the entire German command structure. In Hitler's army, there would be no more retreating. Willpower, fanaticism, refusal to yield, these would be Germany's weapons against the Russian winter and the Red Army's numbers. Hitler convinced himself that the winter crisis had been overcome not through tactical flexibility, but through his personal intervention, his refusal to allow panic, his iron will imposed on the situation. He began to see himself not just as a political leader or even a supreme commander, but as a force of nature whose willpower could override military reality. This wasn't confidence, it was delusion, but it was a delusion that would shape every decision he made in 1942 and beyond. By spring 1942, Hitler had convinced himself he understood the secret to victory in the East: never give ground voluntarily. The German army would hold every position, fight for every meter, refuse to break no matter what. This wasn't military doctrine based on staff studies and historical analysis. It was almost religious faith, a conviction that reality itself could be bent through sheer force of will. And it would become the doctrine that destroyed the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. The 1942 summer offensive was born from this mindset, but also from Germany's desperate strategic situation. The Reich was running out of fuel. The oil fields of Romania and the synthetic fuel plants couldn't meet the Wehrmacht's needs. The German war machine was literally running on fumes. Hitler decided that the 1942 offensive would focus on seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus, the vast petroleum reserves that could fuel the German military for years to come. This was the strategic objective that made sense. Everything else was secondary. But Hitler couldn't resist dividing his forces, exactly what he'd criticized Napoleon for doing, and pursuing two objectives simultaneously. One group would drive towards the oil fields of the Caucasus, the other would secure the Volga River and capture the industrial city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Here's where Hitler's obsession with symbolism began to override military sense. Stalingrad wasn't strategically essential in the way Moscow or Leningrad were. Yes, it was an industrial center producing tanks and weapons. Yes, it sat on the Volga River, a major transport artery that carried oil from the Caucasus to central Russia. But from a purely military standpoint, the city could have been isolated, bypassed, neutralized without the need for a grinding urban battle. German forces could have cut the Volga north and south of the city, strangling it without ever entering the ruins. Your generals knew this. Some of them even suggested it, carefully and cautiously, knowing how he reacted to unwelcome advice. But Hitler had become fixated on the name. Stalingrad, the city of Stalin. What better way to humiliate the Soviet dictator than to erase his namesake from the map? What better propaganda victory than to plant the swastika banner on the ruins of Stalin's city?
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And here's the chilling part. Stalin felt exactly the same way. When his commanders suggested abandoning Stalingrad and retreating to more defensible positions, Stalin refused with almost identical language to Hitler. Two dictators, two egos, two cities full of men who would die because their leaders had turned geography into personal mythology. The parallel is so perfect it's almost supernatural, and it meant that neither side could ever back down, no matter the cost. Hitler saw the war in the East not just as a military campaign, but as a personal duel between himself and Stalin. Two dictators, two ideologies, Two visions of the future locked in mortal combat. Capturing Stalingrad became, in his mind, essential not for military reasons, but for psychological ones. It would prove to the world, and especially to Stalin, who was stronger, whose will was greater, whose destiny was more certain. This wasn't strategy, this was personal. This was ego elevated to the level of national policy. And when strategy becomes personal, when military operations serve ego rather than military objectives, soldiers die in numbers that defy comprehension. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the Sixth Army as it approached Stalingrad in August 1942. To understand why the disaster unfolded as it did, we need to understand Paulus himself, because his personality would become as much a prison for his army as the Soviet encirclement. He was a staff officer by training and temperament, meticulous and obedient, the kind of man who followed orders precisely and expected his subordinates to do the same. He had served as deputy chief of the general staff during the planning of Operation Barbarossa, where his organizational skills and attention to detail had been invaluable. But here's what makes Paulus's story so tragic. He had actually warned against the invasion of Russia. In the planning stages, he'd cautiously suggested that the logistics didn't support such a vast operation. He was ignored. Now he was being sent to execute the very plan he privately doubted. It's a pattern we'll see again and again. Men who knew better, who saw the disaster coming, but who followed orders anyway because the system demanded obedience over wisdom. He was not a bold innovator like Guderian or a charismatic battlefield leader like Rommel. He was a professional who believed in the chain of command, in the system, in doing his duty as the system defined it. These qualities had made him a successful staff officer. They would make him a tragic field commander. Paulus was a man who needed clear orders, defined objectives, and confidence that his superiors understood the situation. When those elements disappeared at Stalingrad, when the situation became chaotic and his superiors issued orders that contradicted reality, Paulus found himself psychologically unable to act independently. The approach to Stalingrad went well at first, which only made the eventual disaster more shocking. The German army was experienced, well-equipped, and confident. They'd already conquered most of Europe. The Soviet forces in front of them seemed to be crumbling, retreating in the same disorder that had characterized the Red Army's performance in 1941. By late August, German tanks of the 14th Panzer Corps had reached the Volga north of the city, cutting off Stalingrad from the rest of the Soviet Union except for precarious ferry crossings under constant bombardment. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe subjected the city to massive aerial bombardment, launching over 2,000 sorties in a single day. The bombing was intended to break Soviet resistance, to create such devastation that the city would simply collapse. Instead, it created the conditions for one of the most savage battles in human history. The bombing turned Stalingrad into a landscape of ruins, and ruins, as the Germans were about to learn, are hell to attack and paradise to defend. Now pay attention to this because it reveals the first massive miscalculation that would doom the Sixth Army. Hitler believed that bombing Stalingrad into rubble would make it easier to capture. The opposite happened. Every pile of rubble became a fortress, every basement became a bunker, every destroyed building became a sniper's nest with interlocking fields of fire. The streets became kill zones where German tanks couldn't maneuver effectively, where superiority in numbers and equipment meant nothing, where warfare became intimate and savage. The Soviets poured reinforcements across the Volga at night, small groups of desperate men tasked with holding the city block by block, building by building, room by room. Soviet commanders implemented a brutal but effective strategy. Keep the German and Soviet lines so close together that German artillery and air support couldn't be used without hitting their own troops. Sometimes, the lines were separated by a single wall, with Germans in one room and Soviets in the next, fighting with grenades and knives. Think about that for a moment. Imagine fighting an enemy so close you can hear them breathing through the wall. Imagine throwing a grenade into a room and having it thrown back before it explodes. Imagine fighting for a staircase for 3 days straight, going up and down the same 12 steps in an endless cycle of attack and counterattack. This was Stalingrad. The average distance between lines in Stalingrad was often less than a grenade's throw. This proximity neutralized Germany's advantages in fire support and turned the battle into a primitive struggle for survival. The battle turned into something no one had planned for, a meat grinder of urban warfare that consumed men and material at a horrifying rate. German soldiers who had conquered France in weeks found themselves fighting for days to capture a single apartment building. The famous Pavlov's house, a fortified apartment building held by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and about 60 Soviet soldiers, held out for 58 days against repeated German assaults. Think about that number, 58 days. The Germans conquered France in 6 weeks, but one apartment building in Stalingrad took longer to capture than entire countries. And here's the kicker, they never actually captured it. Pavlov's men held it until the Soviet counteroffensive broke the siege. A grain elevator became the site of fighting so intense that soldiers later described it as fighting room to room with grenades, knives, and bare hands, the air so thick with dust and smoke that visibility was measured in feet, not yards. One Soviet soldier described finding German and Soviet corpses so intertwined in hand-to-hand combat that they couldn't be separated without breaking bones. The fighting had been that close, that savage. One Soviet soldier described the fighting as, "We would spend the whole day clearing a street from one end to the other, establish blocks and fire points at the western end, and prepare for another slice of enemy territory to be captured the next day. But by dawn, the Germans would start up again, and soon you would discover that you had to clear the same street all over again, fight through the same ruins." This wasn't the clean, mobile warfare the Wehrmacht excelled at. This wasn't the sweeping encirclements and rapid advances that had made them masters of Europe. This was something primal and savage, something that threw away Germany's technological and tactical advantages and reduced warfare to its most basic elements: willpower, endurance, and the capacity to absorb losses. The average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. Let that sink in. You could arrive in the city in the morning and be dead before the next dawn. The Soviet commanders knew this. They factored it into their planning. They calculated how many men they needed to feed into the city each night to maintain defensive strength, knowing that most wouldn't survive to see another night. It was mathematics written in blood. German casualties mounted into tens of thousands, and still, neither side would yield because both dictators had decided that this ruined city on the Volga would be the place where their personal contest would be decided. But here's what's coming that changes everything. While Hitler and Stalin were locked in their death grip over Stalingrad, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was planning something neither dictator expected, a trap so ambitious, so perfectly concealed that when it sprang shut, it would encircle the entire Sixth Army in a single week. The signs were there. German intelligence officers reported strange movements on the flanks. Romanian commanders begged for reinforcements, warning they couldn't hold against a major attack. But Hitler ignored every warning, every sign, every desperate plea. Why? Stay with me, because the answer reveals the fatal flaw that would destroy not just the Sixth Army, but ultimately the entire Third Reich. Hitler followed the battle obsessively from his headquarters far to the west, first in Prussia and then in Ukraine. He demanded daily reports, multiple times a day. He studied maps with a magnifying glass, memorizing street names, tracking individual buildings changing hands. He sent constant orders about which blocks must be taken, which streets must be held, which factories must be captured. He micromanaged the battle from hundreds of miles away, overriding his field commanders, demanding advances when advances were suicidal, forbidding withdrawals when withdrawals made tactical sense. Hitler became convinced that capturing Stalingrad completely was not just possible, but necessary. Not just necessary, but inevitable. The city had become, in his mind, a test of wills between himself and Stalin, a contest that transcended military logic. Whoever blinked first, whoever pulled back, whoever admitted that the cost was too high, that leader would lose not just the battle, but the moral authority to lead their nation. It was a logic that made sense only inside Hitler's increasingly delusional mind, but it was a logic that would kill hundreds of thousands. This was madness, but it was madness that infected the entire German high command through a combination of fear and shared delusion. Officers who might have questioned the wisdom of pouring more troops into the urban hellscape kept silent, terrified of Hitler's rage. The Führer had already fired dozens of generals for suggesting retreats or expressing doubt. The survivors learned to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear, to present optimistic assessments, to claim that just one more push would bring victory. The entire command structure had become corrupt, not through greed, but through cowardice, through the entirely rational fear that telling the truth would end careers or worse. By November 1942, the Sixth Army had pushed deep into Stalingrad, controlling about 90% of the city. The Soviet forces clung to a few desperate pockets along the Volga riverbank, some of them less than a few hundred yards deep. It seemed like the Germans had almost won, just a bit more pressure, a few more days of attacks, and the last Soviet resistance would crumble. Paulus reported optimistically that one more push, a few more weeks, and the city would be theirs completely. Hitler was jubilant. He gave speeches promising victory, declaring that no force on earth would dislodge the German army from Stalin's city now that they held it. In one speech, he actually said, "You can be certain that no one will ever drive us away from Stalingrad." The audience erupted in applause. Within weeks, those words would become the cruelest irony in military history. But while Hitler celebrated and Paulus ground forward meter by bloody meter, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was planning something the Germans never saw coming. Zhukov was perhaps the greatest Soviet military commander of the war, a man who combined tactical skill with strategic vision and the political cunning to survive Stalin's purges and paranoia. He had helped save Moscow in 1941. Now he would engineer the greatest Soviet victory of the war. The Soviets hadn't been reinforcing Stalingrad just to hold it, though holding it was essential. They'd been holding it to fix the German army in place, to keep it focused on the city, to keep it from noticing what was happening on the flanks. Every German soldier, tank, and artillery piece sucked into Stalingrad's ruins was one fewer asset available to defend the long, vulnerable flanks that stretched north and south of the city. And here's where the trap becomes brilliantly, terrifyingly perfect. The flanks were held by Romania, Hungary, and Italy, Germany's allies, but allies equipped with outdated weapons, minimal anti-tank defenses, and soldiers who'd been conscripted from countries that didn't really want to be in the war. German officers knew these flanks were weak. They filed reports, they requested reinforcements, they warned that a Soviet breakthrough was possible, even likely. Hitler read these reports and did nothing. Why? Because every available soldier, every tank, every artillery piece was being funneled into Stalingrad itself. The city had become a black hole, sucking in resources, consuming everything, leaving the flanks naked and vulnerable. Hitler knew the risks. He chose to ignore them. In his mind, capturing Stalingrad was worth any risk, any cost. That decision, that one moment of prioritizing ego over strategy, would destroy an army. To the north and south of Stalingrad, the German lines were held not by elite Wehrmacht troops, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces, allies who were poorly equipped, poorly trained, and deeply demoralized by the brutal Eastern Front conditions. These troops had neither the equipment nor the motivation to hold against a major Soviet assault. German commanders knew the flanks were weak, but couldn't strengthen them because Hitler insisted that every available resource go into capturing Stalingrad itself. The Soviets had been quietly massing fresh armies in the forests and ravines beyond these weak points, moving tanks, artillery, and hundreds of thousands of troops. They'd done it in secret, moving at night, using maskurova, military deception, to hide their preparations. Radio silence was enforced. Dummy positions were created to draw German reconnaissance. New units were moved into position under cover of darkness and hidden during the day. It was a masterpiece of operational security, and the Germans suspected nothing. Well, that's not quite true. Some Germans suspected. Intelligence officers noted increased radio traffic. Reconnaissance patrols reported seeing tank tracks. Interrogated Soviet prisoners mentioned fresh divisions arriving. Romanian commanders sent increasingly desperate messages warning that something big was coming. But all these warnings were filtered through a command structure that only wanted to hear good news, that had learned the hard way that bad news made Hitler furious. So the warnings were downplayed, dismissed, or simply never forwarded to Hitler's headquarters. The officers who could have acted on the intelligence were too afraid to be wrong, too concerned about their careers, too psychologically invested in the narrative that victory at Stalingrad was imminent. It's one of history's great examples of how authoritarian systems create their own blind spots, how fear of the leader prevents the flow of information the leader needs to make good decisions. On November 19, 1942, as snow began to fall across the steppe, the temperature dropping below freezing, Soviet artillery opened fire along the Romanian Third Army's positions north of Stalingrad. The sound was apocalyptic, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, a rolling barrage that turned the Romanian positions into a landscape of fire and flying earth. The bombardment lasted 80 minutes, pulverizing defensive positions, cutting communications, creating total chaos. Then the tanks came, hundreds of them, T-34s and KV-1s emerging from the snow and morning mist like mechanical demons, followed by waves of infantry. The Romanian Third Army disintegrated in hours. Some units fought bravely but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and firepower. Others broke and fled in panic, abandoning their positions, their weapons, everything. The Soviet tanks punched through and kept driving, racing deep into the rear areas, overrunning supply dumps, headquarters, artillery positions. The next day, November 20th, Soviet forces struck from the south, smashing through the Romanian Fourth Army with the same devastating combination of artillery, armor, and infantry. The two pincers, Operation Uranus as the Soviets codenamed it, drove deep behind the German positions in Stalingrad, curving around the city like the jaws of a trap. On November 23rd, 4 days after the offensive began, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalash on the Don River, about 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The trap was shut. The Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, Germany's largest and most powerful field army, was encircled, cut off from supply and reinforcement, surrounded by Soviet forces that were growing stronger by the day. And here's the moment that will haunt you. When the two Soviet columns met and the encirclement was complete, the Soviet officers opened bottles of vodka and celebrated. They knew what they'd done. They'd trapped an entire German army. Meanwhile, in Stalingrad, German soldiers were still fighting for buildings, still believing victory was days away, still having no idea that they'd just become prisoners in an open-air death camp. The disconnect between perception and reality was total. This was the moment. This was when everything changed, when the disaster could still have been averted, when retreat was still possible, when Hitler had to choose between his ego and his soldiers' lives. This was the moment when pride became policy, when symbolism trumped survival, when the lives of 300,000 men hung on the decision of one man sitting in a headquarters hundreds of miles away. Paulus immediately radioed for permission to break out. The message was urgent, desperate even, though couched in the formal military language of the era. His corps commanders were unanimous. They had to retreat immediately while they still had fuel, ammunition, and fighting strength. Every hour they waited made escape more difficult as the Soviet encirclement solidified. Break out to the southwest, they urged. Fight through the thinnest part of the Soviet lines before the enemy could consolidate their positions and bring up reinforcements. Yes, they'd have to abandon heavy equipment. Yes, they'd have to leave behind the wounded who couldn't be moved. Yes, they'd suffer casualties fighting through the Soviet lines, but the army would survive to fight another day. The Sixth Army could be reconstituted, rebuilt, returned to combat effectiveness. Staying in the pocket meant inevitable destruction. The arguments for breakout were overwhelming from a military standpoint. The Sixth Army still had combat power, still had fuel for its vehicles, still had enough ammunition for a fighting retreat. The Soviet encirclement was fresh, not yet fully organized, with gaps that could be exploited. Speed was essential. Every day of delay meant the Soviets could bring up more troops, more tanks, more artillery. Every day meant consuming supplies that would be needed for the breakout. Every day meant growing weaker while the enemy grew stronger. And here's the critical detail that makes what happens next even more tragic. Military analysts after the war calculated that if the Sixth Army had begun breaking out on November 24th, just one day after the encirclement was complete, they had an 80% chance of successfully escaping. By November 26th, that dropped to 60%. By November 30th, it was less than 40%. Every day Hitler delayed, thousands more men were condemned to death. The window of opportunity was slamming shut in real time, and everyone inside the pocket could feel it. Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia was thrown into chaos by the news. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Wehrmacht didn't get encircled. They were the ones who did the encircling. It was humiliating, shocking, unthinkable. Advisors clustered around maps arguing about possibilities, calculating distances and logistics. Some generals supported Paulus's request. They'd seen this before. Soviet winter offensives encircled German units. The pattern was clear: break out immediately or face destruction. Field Marshal von Weichs, commander of Army Group B, which included the Sixth Army, also recommended immediate breakout. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, argued passionately for authorizing the breakout. The professional military men understood the situation perfectly. But Hermann Göring, Hitler's corpulent Air Force commander, longtime political enforcer and designated successor, saw an opportunity to restore his declining fortunes. Göring was desperate to restore his standing with Hitler after the Luftwaffe's failures. The failure to destroy the RAF in the Battle of Britain, the failure to stop Allied bombing of German cities, a long string of broken promises and embarrassing defeats. He needed a win, needed to prove his value, needed to show Hitler that the Luftwaffe could still perform miracles. And here's where things take a turn into absolute insanity. Göring wasn't even at Hitler's headquarters when he made his fateful promise. He was at his luxurious estate, Karenhall, lounging in silk robes, playing with his model trains. Yes, he had a room full of model trains when he got the phone call about Stalingrad being encircled. He barely looked at the logistics reports. He just picked up the phone and called Hitler directly, bypassing all the staff officers who might have told him his promise was impossible. Göring promised Hitler that his Air Force could supply the Sixth Army by air until a relief force broke through the Soviet lines. He cited the recent example of Demyansk, where a smaller German pocket of about 100,000 troops had been supplied by air for several months earlier in 1942. He spoke with absolute confidence, with the authority of a man who had been at Hitler's side from the early days of the Nazi Party, with the conviction of someone who had never personally experienced the realities of winter on the Russian steppe, or understood the logistics of aerial supply. The numbers told a completely different story, and anyone who bothered to check them would have known Göring's promise was impossible. The Sixth Army needed a minimum of 500 tons of supplies daily just to survive: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, winter clothing, spare parts, and all the other material a modern army requires. To maintain combat effectiveness and have any hope of holding out until relief arrived, they needed closer to 800 tons per day. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet, even operating at absolute maximum capacity in perfect weather with no losses, couldn't deliver even 300 tons per day to Stalingrad. The distance from the nearest German airfields to Stalingrad was over 200 miles, meaning each plane could make at most one round trip per day, often less. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 300 U-52 transport planes available, and many of those were in poor mechanical condition after years of war. Each U-52 could carry about 2 tons of cargo. Do the math. Even if every plane flew every day with no mechanical problems, no weather delays, and no combat losses, it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. And that's assuming perfect conditions. In reality, the Russian winter would ground planes for days at a time. Soviet fighters would shoot down dozens. Mechanical failures would sideline others. The Luftwaffe's own logistics officers who tried to explain this reality to Goering were ignored, dismissed, or transferred. The chief quartermaster of the Luftwaffe tried to present the real numbers to Goering and was told to shut up. Other officers who expressed doubt were accused of defeatism. Goering had committed himself publicly, and his ego wouldn't allow him to back down even when confronted with mathematical proof that his promise was impossible. But here's what you need to remember for what comes later. Hitler knew the numbers too. His staff presented him with the calculations. They showed him that the Luftwaffe couldn't possibly deliver enough supplies. Hitler looked at the numbers, understood what they meant, and chose to believe Goering anyway. Why? Because Goering's promise gave him permission to do what he wanted to do anyway, refuse the retreat and condemn the Sixth Army to destruction rather than admit failure. Hitler listened to what he wanted to hear. Goering's promise gave him a way out of the terrible choice between admitting failure and condemning the Sixth Army to death. If the Luftwaffe could supply the army by air, then there was no need to retreat. The Sixth Army could hold Stalingrad, tying down Soviet forces, while a relief force was organized to break through and reopen the land route. It was a fantasy, but it was a fantasy that allowed Hitler to avoid the one thing his psychology couldn't tolerate, admitting he'd made a mistake. Retreat would mean abandoning the ruins they'd paid for in blood. It would mean admitting that the entire Stalingrad offensive had been a failure, that months of fighting and tens of thousands of casualties had achieved nothing. It would mean giving back to Stalin the city that bore his name, a propaganda disaster of the first magnitude. It would mean admitting failure publicly, in front of the German people, in front of the world. More than that, retreat would undermine the entire military ideology Hitler had built around willpower and refusal to yield. After the winter crisis of 1941, Hitler had convinced himself that the Wehrmacht had been saved not by tactical flexibility, but by his personal order to stand fast, to never retreat, to hold every position regardless of cost. He'd built this into doctrine, into the fundamental operating principle of the German army in the East. If the Sixth Army retreated from Stalingrad, what would stop other German armies from retreating when things got difficult? The entire military philosophy he'd imposed after the Moscow defeat would be exposed as hollow. There was also the personal element, the rivalry with Stalin that had become an obsession. Hitler saw the war in the East as a personal duel, a contest of wills between himself and the Soviet dictator. Stalingrad had become the symbolic battleground of that contest. Retreating meant Stalin had won, that Stalin's will was stronger, that Hitler had blinked first. For a man whose entire political identity was built on never yielding, never compromising, always dominating, this was psychologically impossible. On November 22, 1942, Hitler sent his response to Paulus. It came as a direct Führer order, stamped with the highest authority, allowing absolutely no discussion or interpretation. The Sixth Army will form a hedgehog defense and await relief. The Luftwaffe will supply the army by air. No retreat. And here's what you need to hear, because this is where the story becomes almost unbearably personal. Paulus read that telegram and wept. His chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, found him in his bunker with tears streaming down his face, the telegram crumpled in his hand. Paulus knew what that order meant. He knew his army was being condemned to death, but he also knew he would obey it, because disobeying a direct order from the Führer was something his mind simply couldn't process. His personal tragedy was that he saw his fate coming and walked into it anyway, bound by duty and honor to a leader who felt neither duty nor honor toward him. Paulus read the telegram in silence in his headquarters bunker. Around him, his staff officers waited, hoping against hope for permission to break out, to save the army while salvation was still possible. When Paulus read them Hitler's order, the room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Officers looked at each other, stunned, unable to believe what they'd just heard. Surely Hitler didn't understand this situation. Surely this was a temporary order until he could be properly briefed. Some officers argued passionately that they should disobey, that Hitler was hundreds of miles away and didn't understand the reality on the ground, that saving the army was more important than following a suicidal order. General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of LI Corps, was particularly vocal. He was a decorated officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man with nothing to prove about his courage or loyalty. Von Seydlitz argued that Paulus had a moral duty to his men that superseded his duty to Hitler, that obeying this order meant condemning hundreds of thousands to death, that history would judge them for this decision. He pounded the table, he raised his voice, something junior officers simply didn't do in the hierarchical German military. He begged Paulus to see reason, to act independently, to save the army regardless of orders. And here's where we come to the promised moment, the one general who tried to save the army by disobeying orders. Remember I told you about him? General von Seydlitz, frustrated beyond measure, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. On November 25th, without waiting for Paulus's permission, without orders from anyone, he began withdrawing his corps from their positions in the northern part of the pocket. He was initiating a breakout on his own authority, hoping to create a fait accompli, hoping that once his troops were moving westward, Paulus would have no choice but to order the rest of the army to follow. It was an extraordinary courage and desperation, an attempt to force Paulus's hand by creating a situation where disobedience had already occurred, and the only question was whether to support it or abandon an entire corps. Von Seydlitz knew the risks. Disobeying orders in the German military could mean execution, but he decided that saving his men was worth the risk to himself. For a few hours it seemed like it might work. His troops began withdrawing, moving westward, preparing to punch through the Soviet lines. But Paulus, bound by duty and honor and his psychological inability to disobey Hitler, ordered von Seydlitz to halt and return to his positions immediately. The order was explicit: stop the withdrawal, return to the original positions, or face court-martial. Paulus complied, though it broke something inside him. He would later join the Soviet-sponsored League of German Officers and broadcast anti-Nazi propaganda, his loyalty to Hitler shattered by this moment when obedience meant death for his men. The one chance for independent action died in that moment. The trap had closed, and now it would slowly tighten around the throats of 300,000 men. But don't think the story of resistance ends there. What happened inside that pocket over the next 2 months, the quiet acts of rebellion, the small mercies, the letters that were written and hidden knowing they'd never be sent, that story reveals something profound about human nature under impossible pressure. Stay with me. The first weeks of the encirclement were almost bearable, which made the eventual horror worse because hope lingered longer. The German troops were veterans, hardened by 2 years of fighting in Russia, used to hardship and privation. They still had substantial ammunition stockpiles, enough food for a few weeks if carefully rationed, fuel for their vehicles, functioning equipment. They fortified their positions, dug deeper bunkers, prepared defensive lines to repel Soviet attacks. Many convinced themselves this was just a temporary setback, that the Wehrmacht would punch through the Soviet lines any day now, that this was just another crisis to endure until relief arrived. The propaganda helped maintain morale at first. Radio broadcasts from Germany assured them that massive relief forces were being organized, that the Luftwaffe was flying in supplies, that the Führer himself was personally directing operations to save them. Some of this was true. A relief operation was being planned, but the scale and timeline were grotesquely optimistic. The soldiers didn't know that the promises were hollow, that the supply operation was already failing, that they'd been written off as acceptable losses in service of Hitler's ego. But the Luftwaffe's air supply operation was a catastrophic failure from the start, doomed by impossible logistics, terrible weather, and Soviet opposition. Transport planes flew through blizzards and Soviet fighter screens, delivering a tiny fraction of what had been promised. On a good day, maybe 100 tons reached the pocket, 1/5 of the minimum needed for survival. On bad days, and there were many bad days, nothing arrived at all. Planes were shot down by Soviet fighters, crashed in storms, turned back by weather, landed at the wrong airfields in the snow and confusion. And here's what a detail shows how far removed from reality Hitler's headquarters had become. On November 22, when the Luftwaffe managed to deliver 140 tons in one day, a record, Hitler's staff celebrated it as proof the air supply was working. They sent congratulatory telegrams to Goering. They told Pallas to see the Luftwaffe was delivering as promised. They apparently didn't notice, or chose not to notice, that even this record delivery was less than 1/3 of what the army needed daily just to avoid slowly starving to death. The supplies that did arrive were often absurdly inappropriate, revealing the chaos and dysfunction of the German supply system. One famous shipment contained thousands of contraceptives and summer uniforms, items that were utterly useless to men freezing to death in a Russian winter. Another delivery brought champagne and caviar, luxuries meant for officers' Christmas parties, arriving in a city where men were beginning to starve. One shipment included thousands of left boots, no right boots, just left ones. Another brought pepper and marjoram by the ton, while medicine and ammunition were desperately scarce. It would be darkly funny if it weren't so tragic, if each absurd delivery didn't represent another day when desperately needed supplies failed to arrive, another day closer to mass starvation. But here's what really happened, and this is where the story becomes almost too dark to believe. Some of the Luftwaffe supply officers were deliberately sending useless items because they were profiting from the chaos. They were selling the good supplies, food, medicine, ammunition on the black market and sending garbage to Stalingrad because nobody was checking. Men died so that corrupt officers hundreds of miles away could get rich. When this was discovered after the war, most of those officers had conveniently died in Allied bombing raids. Justice was never served. The daily ration was cut. A German soldier normally received about 4,000 calories per day to sustain combat operations in winter. By mid-December, the ration in the pocket had been cut to 1,500 calories, barely enough for sedentary office work, nowhere near enough for soldiers fighting and enduring brutal cold. By late December, it was down to 700 calories, starvation level, barely enough to sustain life, certainly not enough to maintain combat effectiveness or resist cold.
Then the rations were cut again and again. Men's bodies began consuming themselves, burning muscle for fuel, vital organs beginning to fail. Soldiers began slaughtering their horses for meat, something German troops were forbidden to do under normal circumstances because horses were essential for logistics. But these weren't normal circumstances. The horses were butchered and eaten. Then other animals, dogs, cats, rats, anything with protein. One officer's diary records trading his Iron Cross medal for a skinned cat. Men made soup from bones, picked clean and boiled again and again until they crumbled into calcium powder. They boiled leather boots and belts, trying to extract nutrition from the protein in the leather, though this typically just caused severe diarrhea that further weakened them. Some men, in absolute desperation, were caught eating human flesh from the frozen corpses that littered the battlefield. This was never official, never ordered, but it happened. Officers who discovered it typically looked the other way, understanding that hunger had driven men beyond the boundaries of civilization. What do you do when a starving soldier is caught carving meat from a frozen corpse? Shoot him for violating military law? He's going to die anyway. Most officers just walked away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. The cold was merciless, dropping to -30 degrees Celsius and below, with wind chills making it feel even colder. These were temperatures where exposed skin freezes in minutes, where metal burns like fire when touched with bare hands, where breathing the air hurts your lungs, where your exhaled breath freezes into ice crystals that coat your scarf and collar. The Germans had been fighting since summer, and most still wore the same uniforms, now tattered and filthy. They hadn't been issued proper winter clothing because the campaign was supposed to be over before winter arrived. Some men wrapped themselves in paper from destroyed buildings, in rags torn from corpses, in anything that might provide insulation. They stuffed newspapers inside their uniforms for insulation. They wrapped their feet in layers of fabric scavenged from the dead. Frostbite casualties outnumbered battle casualties by a huge margin. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, noses to the cold, extremities turning black, then numb, then falling off. Some lost entire hands or feet, the flesh simply dying and detaching from the body. The field hospitals were overwhelmed with frostbite cases, and with no supplies to treat them properly, amputation was often the only option. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthetic, holding down screaming men while they sawed through frozen flesh and bone with hacksaws designed for wood. The screams could be heard blocks away. Many men died of shock during these procedures. Others died later from infection because there were no antibiotics. Some begged to be shot rather than endure amputation without morphine. Men froze to death in their foxholes, found in the morning frozen in sitting positions, rifles still in hand, eyes still open, bodies rigid as statues. Sometimes men died standing up, frozen in place while on watch, and nobody knew they were dead until someone tried to relieve them and the corpse toppled over like a statue. The ground was frozen so hard that burying them was impossible. The dead were stacked like cordwood outside bunkers, frozen solid, waiting for a thaw that wouldn't come until spring. Some units used frozen corpses to reinforce defensive positions, stacking them like sandbags because they were more plentiful than actual sandbags. The living envied the dead their peace, their freedom from hunger and cold and fear. One soldier's letter found on his frozen body after the war read, "We're not human anymore. We're just frozen meat waiting to die. The lucky ones are already gone. The rest of us shuffle around like ghosts, barely remembering what it felt like to be warm, to be full, to be alive. Tell my children I loved them. Tell them I was a coward at the end, that I wanted to run away, that I cried for my mother. Tell them the truth, that heroes are just men who died before they could admit they were afraid." The wounded suffered worst of all. The field hospitals were overwhelmed, lacking medicine, bandages, anesthesia, heat, everything necessary to care for the wounded properly. Men with survivable wounds died slowly because there was nothing to treat them with. A simple bullet wound that could have been cleaned and bandaged became a death sentence when infection set in and there were no antibiotics. Dysentery and typhus spread through the crowded, filthy bunkers where men huddled for warmth. Lice infested everyone, spreading disease, adding another layer of misery to the nightmare. Men scratched themselves bloody trying to relieve the itching, creating more wounds that became infected. Some men went mad from the combination of hunger, cold, disease, and constant fear. They would suddenly stand up and walk toward Soviet lines, arms raised, hoping to be captured or killed, no longer caring which. The Luftwaffe supposedly prioritized evacuating the wounded on return flights, but most transport planes flew out empty or carrying officers and specialists seeking to escape. Sometimes high-ranking officers would commandeer entire planes for themselves and their personal effects, while wounded men froze on the runway watching them take off. Only a fraction of the wounded ever made it onto evacuation flights. The selection process was brutal and often corrupt. Officers and their favorites got priority. Common soldiers with catastrophic wounds were left to die because they weren't worth the space on a plane. The rest suffered and died in the hospitals, or in bunkers, or in the snow, their screams becoming part of the background noise of the pocket, something everyone learned to tune out because acknowledging it was unbearable. Men suicided rather than endure the agony of infected wounds and gangrene without morphine or hope. They would crawl outside during the night and freeze to death, the cold making it relatively painless once you got past the initial agony. Or they'd shoot themselves with whatever weapon they could reach. Officers stopped counting suicide deaths after a while. The numbers were too depressing, and what did it matter anyway? And through all of this, through the starvation and cold and disease and death, Hitler's orders remained unchanged. Hold the position, stand fast, the relief force is coming, victory or death.
The disconnect between the reality inside the pocket and the delusions being transmitted from Hitler's headquarters would have been comical if it weren't killing thousands daily. Radio messages from Hitler's headquarters spoke of honor, duty, the glory of sacrifice for the Reich. They promised that history would remember the Sixth Army's heroic stand. They assured the trapped soldiers that their sacrifice was meaningful, that they were buying time for the rest of the German army to stabilize the Eastern Front. But the soldiers reading these messages knew better by now. They could see they'd been abandoned. They could see that the supply operation was a failure, that the relief force wasn't coming, that they'd been written off. The propaganda that had sustained them was revealed as lies, and that psychological collapse was in some ways worse than the physical suffering. Yet here's what's remarkable, what speaks to something profound about human resilience. Even in these impossible conditions, acts of kindness and humanity persisted. Soldiers shared their meager rations with wounded comrades. Medical personnel worked themselves to exhaustion, trying to save lives with no supplies. Officers lied to their men, maintaining the fiction that relief was coming, because giving them hope seemed kinder than telling them the truth.
Some men kept diaries, knowing they would probably die, but wanting to leave some record of what happened, some testament to their suffering. Others wrote final letters to families, entrusting them to comrades who might somehow survive, though they knew the odds were terrible. And in perhaps the most poignant detail, on Christmas Eve 1942, as men starved and froze in bunkers across the pocket, small groups gathered to sing carols. Their voices, weak from hunger and muffled by cold, rose into the frozen night. Silent night, O come all ye faithful, songs of peace and hope sung by men who had neither and knew they never would again. Soviet soldiers in nearby positions could hear the singing and stopped shooting for a few hours, their own commanders unable to order them to fire on men singing Christmas carols. It was a moment of shared humanity in the midst of mechanized horror, a reminder that the war had been created by the egos of dictators, not by the soldiers who were dying for those egos. But morning came and the killing resumed, because neither Hitler nor Stalin would allow their personal contest to end any other way than total victory or total destruction. Now we come to the relief operation, the last desperate attempt to save the Sixth Army, and the moment when Hitler's refusal to act destroyed what little hope remained. Remember this part because it reveals the ultimate betrayal. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most talented commanders and perhaps the best operational-level commander the Wehrmacht possessed, did launch a relief operation in December 1942. Operation Winter Storm began on December 12 with some of the Wehrmacht's best remaining divisions, the 6th Panzer Division, the 23rd Panzer Division, elite units pulled from other parts of the Eastern Front at enormous risk. These were the troops Germany could least afford to lose, committed to a desperate gamble to save the Sixth Army. Manstein's panzers drove northeast toward Stalingrad through Soviet resistance, snowstorms, and mechanical breakdowns. It was brilliant tactical work, a masterpiece of armored warfare under impossible conditions. For a few days, it seemed like it might actually succeed. The panzers smashed through Soviet defensive lines, racing against time and weather, getting closer to the pocket with each passing day. By December 19, Manstein's forces had reached a point just 30 miles from the Sixth Army's perimeter. 30 miles, a day's march, within artillery range, so close that soldiers in both forces could see each other's signal flares at night, so close that rescue seemed not just possible, but inevitable. This was the moment. This was when the Sixth Army needed to break out and link up with Manstein's relief force. The original plan, Operation Thunderclap, called for exactly this. The Sixth Army would attack westward, while Manstein attacked eastward, the two forces meeting in the middle, creating a corridor through which the trapped army could escape. Inside the pocket, Paulus prepared his forces for the breakout.
Units were positioned for the attack, officers briefed their men, fuel was carefully husbanded for the vehicles that would lead the charge. The trapped soldiers, hearing that relief was only 30 miles away, felt hope for the first time in weeks. They were going to be saved. They were going to get out. The nightmare was almost over. Paulus sent urgent messages to Hitler's headquarters. Manstein is 30 miles away. Request permission to initiate Operation Thunderclap. Request immediate permission to break out and link up with relief force. The message was desperate, urgent, the military language barely concealing the plea, "Let us save ourselves while we still can." And Hitler refused. He ordered Paulus to remain in position and wait for Manstein to reach them at their current positions. No breakout, no movement westward, just wait. This decision, this one moment, is perhaps the clearest evidence of Hitler's psychology. Manstein himself called Hitler and begged him to authorize the breakout. Manstein explained that his force wasn't strong enough to reach Stalingrad on its own, that Soviet reinforcements were arriving to cut him off, that the window of opportunity was measured in days or even hours. The only way to save the Sixth Army was for it to move westward while he moved eastward, meeting in the middle. Hitler refused. His reasoning reveals everything. If the Sixth Army broke out, it would have to abandon its positions in Stalingrad. It would have to leave behind heavy equipment, wounded soldiers who couldn't march, all the ruins that had been purchased with so much blood. Abandoning Stalingrad was unacceptable to Hitler even to save the army that held it. But there was another reason, one that historians discovered in documents after the war. Hitler had convinced himself that the Sixth Army was serving a crucial strategic purpose by tying down Soviet forces around Stalingrad. He believed that as long as the Sixth Army held out, the Soviets couldn't use those troops elsewhere. The Sixth Army's death was, in Hitler's mind, buying time for the rest of the German Eastern Front to stabilize. This logic was insane on multiple levels. Yes, Soviet forces were tied down around Stalingrad, but so were German forces that could have been fighting elsewhere. The Germans were losing their most powerful field army for the sake of temporarily inconveniencing the Soviets. It was trading a queen for a pawn and calling it strategy. Manstein, realizing Hitler wouldn't budge, made one last desperate plea directly to Paulus: break out without Hitler's permission. Just do it. Ignore the order. Save your army. I'll take the blame. Just get your men out while you still can. For a moment, Paulus wavered. His staff officers begged him to give the order. General Schmidt, his chief of staff, argued that disobeying Hitler to save 300 lives was not just justifiable, but morally required. But Paulus couldn't do it. The combination of his oath to Hitler, his Prussian military training, his psychological need to believe the system made sense, it paralyzed him at the crucial moment. He radioed back to Manstein that he would obey Hitler's orders and wait for relief to reach him. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. Manstein had no choice but to retreat. Soviet counterattacks were threatening to encircle his relief force. If he pushed forward, he'd lose those elite panzer divisions too, and Germany couldn't afford that loss. On December 23rd, Operation Winter Storm was called off. Manstein's panzers withdrew, fighting through Soviet forces that had moved to cut them off, barely escaping encirclement themselves. Inside the pocket, soldiers watched the signal flares from the relief force grow distant, then disappear. They understood what it meant. No relief was coming. They'd been abandoned. The hope that had sustained them for those few weeks died, and with it died much of the army's will to fight. From that point on, many soldiers were just waiting to die, going through the motions of resistance because they didn't know what else to do. That was the last realistic chance for survival, and Hitler's refusal to authorize the breakout had killed it. From December 23rd onward, the Sixth Army's destruction was inevitable. The only questions were how long it would take and how many would die.
By early January 1943, the pocket had been split in half. Communications between the two halves were cut. Units fought in isolation, not knowing if anyone else was still fighting. The Luftwaffe's supply flights became increasingly rare as Soviet fighters dominated the airspace and winter storms grounded aircraft for days at a time. Some days, no planes arrived at all. The starvation accelerated. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets offered surrender terms. The entire army could surrender with guarantees of safety, medical care, and repatriation after the war. It was partly propaganda, but it was also a genuine offer. Soviet commanders could see the Germans were finished and saw no point in killing men who were already defeated. The offer was broadcast in German across the lines. Leaflets were fired into German positions describing the surrender terms. Paulus forwarded the Soviet offer to Hitler, asking for permission to negotiate. Hitler's response came swiftly and reveals everything about his priorities. Surrender is out of the question. The Sixth Army will do its historic duty at Stalingrad until the last man. There it is, the clearest statement of Hitler's priorities. Not saving his soldiers, not military necessity, historic duty, mythology. The army's destruction had become, in Hitler's mind, more valuable than its survival. Dead martyrs serve propaganda better than living, defeated soldiers. The Sixth Army wasn't an army anymore in Hitler's eyes. It was a symbol, a story, a narrative element in the mythology of Nazi Germany's supposed greatness. But Hitler went further. On January 30, 1943, as the pocket was collapsing, as men were dying by the thousands, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. It was announced with great ceremony on German radio. Congratulations were sent. It seemed like an honor, a reward for heroic service. But everyone understood the real message. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in the nation's history. The promotion was really a death sentence, an order disguised as an honor. Hitler was telling Paulus, "You are expected to die. Shoot yourself. Go down with your command. Become the hero I need you to be for propaganda purposes. Don't you dare surrender and ruin the narrative." The cynicism was breathtaking. Hitler was using Paulus's sense of honor and duty as a weapon to compel him to commit suicide. It was manipulation of the cruelest kind, exploiting the very qualities, loyalty, honor, devotion to duty, that made Paulus a good officer, using those qualities to ensure his death. But Paulus, broken and starving, finally saw through it. He realized he'd been used, that his loyalty had been betrayed, that Hitler cared nothing for him or his men. On January 31, 1943, one day after his promotion to field marshal, Paulus surrendered himself and his headquarters staff to Soviet forces. His last radio message to Hitler was a simple acknowledgement that resistance was over. There was no grand heroic statement, no dramatic last words, just the quiet collapse of a man who had finally realized his faith had been misplaced. Some German positions in the northern pocket held out until February 2nd, fighting not because they believed in victory, but because they literally didn't know what else to do. Then, silence. The guns stopped. The battle was over. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers had entered the pocket in November. Fewer than 90,000 survived to be marched into Soviet captivity. Of those 90,000 prisoners, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany after the war. Most died in Soviet captivity, not from deliberate cruelty, though conditions were harsh, but from the simple fact that they were already starving and diseased when captured, and the Soviet Union was itself half-starving and couldn't provide adequate care for massive numbers of prisoners. They died of typhus, dysentery, starvation, and complications from frostbite in camps across Siberia. Their graves, when they were given graves, went unmarked. So why did Hitler do it? After all the evidence, after all the analysis, we return to the question that has haunted this entire story. Why did Adolf Hitler refuse to allow the Sixth Army to retreat when retreat was possible? The answer, now that you've seen the full story, is both simpler and more disturbing than you might imagine. Hitler refused to authorize retreat because doing so would have required him to admit he'd made a mistake.
The entire Nazi ideology was built on the myth of the Führer's infallibility, his spiritual connection to the destiny of the German people, his supernatural ability to will victory into existence through sheer determination. Admitting that Stalingrad was a mistake, that the operation should be abandoned, would crack the foundation of his authority. More specifically, Hitler had built his military doctrine since the winter of 1941-42 around never retreating. He had fired dozens of generals who advocated tactical withdrawals. He had promoted officers who shared his fanaticism. To authorize a retreat from Stalingrad would be to admit that his entire military philosophy since Moscow had been wrong. There was the personal element, the rivalry with Stalin, the obsession with capturing the city that bore Stalin's name. Failing to take it was bad enough. Abandoning it after paying such a high price was psychologically impossible for Hitler. His ego had become entangled with the battle's outcome in a way that made rational decision-making impossible. But perhaps most disturbing is this. Hitler had become fundamentally detached from the human cost of his decisions. In his headquarters, thousands of miles from the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the battle was colored pins on a map, casualty figures in reports. The suffering of individual soldiers, the starvation, the frostbite, the slow death in bunkers was abstract to him.
He could sacrifice the Sixth Army because he didn't have to look into their eyes or hear their screams. This detachment was partly intentional. Nazi ideology had always dehumanized people, treating them as expendable resources in service of the race and the state. Hitler genuinely believed that individuals didn't matter, that only the collective struggle of the German people mattered. If sacrificing 300,000 soldiers at Stalingrad served some greater purpose, even if that purpose was just avoiding the humiliation of retreat, then their deaths were justified in his worldview. He had convinced himself that their destruction served a strategic purpose, that they were tying down Soviet forces, that their heroic sacrifice would inspire the German people to greater efforts. It was all delusion, but it was delusion that felt true inside Hitler's increasingly disconnected mind. The tragedy is that so many followed him into this abyss. Paulus could have disobeyed. Other generals had disobeyed Hitler and survived. Some had even been proven right. But Paulus was too institutionalized, too bound by his concept of duty and honor, too unable to imagine acting independently of the system. His tragedy was that he was a good staff officer thrust into a command position that required independent moral judgment, and he simply couldn't make that leap until it was too late. The soldiers of the Sixth Army had even less agency. They'd been trained to obey, to trust their leaders, to believe in the cause. When those leaders betrayed them and the cause revealed itself as hollow, most couldn't psychologically process it. They clung to hope that the relief force would come, that the Luftwaffe would deliver supplies, that somehow their loyalty would be rewarded. By the time they understood the truth, they were too weak to escape, too broken to resist, too far gone to save themselves. Stalingrad was the turning point of the Eastern Front and arguably of the entire war. After Stalingrad, Germany was permanently on the defensive in the East. The aura of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered. Soviet morale soared while German morale never recovered. Tactically and strategically, the loss was catastrophic. The Sixth Army had been one of Germany's best formations, and it simply ceased to exist. But perhaps the deeper impact was psychological. Stalingrad revealed the hollowness at the heart of Nazi Germany's leadership. It showed that Hitler would sacrifice any number of soldiers rather than admit a mistake. It demonstrated that loyalty to the Führer was a one-way street. He demanded absolute loyalty, but felt no corresponding responsibility to those who served him. Some German officers who survived Stalingrad or learned its lessons became part of the resistance that later attempted to assassinate Hitler in July 1944. They'd learned the hard way that following orders wasn't enough, that there are times when duty to your men supersedes duty to authority.
that blind obedience to an insane leader makes you complicit in that insanity. For the soldiers who died at Stalingrad, it was the ultimate betrayal. They'd been promised they were fighting for their homeland, for civilization, for a glorious future. Instead, they died for one man's ego, in a city reduced to rubble, for objectives that made no military sense, abandoned by leaders who preferred their deaths to the embarrassment of retreat. Their suffering was real, their courage was real, their loyalty was real, but the cause they died for was revealed as utterly hollow. The frozen wastes around Stalingrad hold lessons that transcend military history. This is a story about what happens when authority becomes disconnected from accountability, when loyalty is demanded but not reciprocated, when ego and ideology override reason and humanity. It's a warning about following leaders who cannot admit mistakes, who prize symbolism over substance, who view people as expendable resources rather than as human beings. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat at Stalingrad wasn't an aberration. It was the logical outcome of his entire worldview: authoritarian, inflexible, willing to sacrifice countless lives rather than admit error. The soldiers of the Sixth Army died not because defeat was inevitable, but because their leader preferred their heroic deaths to his personal humiliation. In the end, the ruins of Stalingrad became a tomb for more than just the soldiers who fought there. They became the tomb of Nazi Germany's pretensions to military genius, the tomb of Hitler's myth of infallibility, the tomb of the idea that willpower alone can overcome reality. The Führer who would not allow retreat created the circumstances of his own regime's destruction. The frozen city on the Volga was where the Third Reich, which Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, began its terminal collapse just 12 years after it began. Within 2.5 years of Stalingrad's fall, Hitler would be dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker, his capital in ruins, his Reich shattered, his 1,000-year empire reduced to rubble and ash. The ghosts of Stalingrad whisper a simple truth that echoes through history. Pride comes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Hitler's pride killed the Sixth Army. Eventually, it would kill millions more and drag an entire nation into ruin. The tragedy is that so many saw it happening and still couldn't or wouldn't stop it. That perhaps is the most haunting lesson of all, that systems of absolute authority create their own momentum toward disaster, that good people can be trapped by their concept of duty into serving evil purposes, that the human capacity for rationalization can make us complicit in our own destruction. The frozen soldiers of Stalingrad paid the price for these lessons. The question that should haunt us is whether we've learned them.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.